consent that Lawrence Sarkeesian and Bruno Damasio, interns with my personal staff, be granted floor privileges for today's session.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I've come to the floor today to speak about my two recent fact-finding trips to Cuba. During the first trip, which was an incredible journey across the nation of Cuba, I had conversations with Cuban citizens, farmers, doctors, nurses, students, just a very broad cross-section of the Cuban citizenry, also some government officials too. The second trip involved a one-day visit to the U.S. detention center at Guantanamo Bay. First, I'd like to begin with details of my first trip, which took place during January's recess here in the Senate. First, I want to publicly thank Ambassador Cabañas, the Cuban, well, I guess since we don't have an embassy, he has the rank of ambassador, but he is in charge of the Cuban interest section here. I want to thank him and his staff personally for arranging this and overcoming a lot of different obstacles to make sure that we could take this trip. I guess I am the first senator or congressman to do this kind of a trip. We flew from Miami down to Santiago de Cuba. And we spent couple, 3 days in Santiago de Cuba. And then we drove from Santiago to Holguin to Camagüey, Santa Clara, and into Havana. So we traversed about 700 miles over the week's period that we were there, seeing most of the entire nation of Cuba. One remains I haven't seen. I've never been out the Pinar del Rio area out here in the western part. That's one part that I haven't been. I had visited Havana as a senator 11 years before, but that was only in Havana. This time I wanted to see the country. I wanted to see ordinary Cubans in small towns and communities to get a feel for what it was like in the rest of the country. Most people just go to Havana. Well, that's like going to New York City and saying you've been to America. It's just not the same. It's just not the same. There's a lot more country to Cuba, a lot more things going on than just in Havana. Well, it was clear to me that this trip would be an important moment in Cuban-American relations. Not the trip, but this is a time, I want to say, that's really important in Cuban-American relations. And so I just wanted to share some of the insights I gained during my travels across this nation of 11 million people. As I said, I arrived in Santiago on January the 17th, and over the course of the week we traveled up through the countryside. And again, I want to thank Bernardo Toscano, a Cuban who had been here in the United States, I think 3 or 4 times before. He'd been here in Washington 2 or 3 times, working in their interest section here, and I think once or twice in New York with their interest section in New York. And so we met him, and he came with us to Santiago and then sort of was our host or with us all during our trip. Bernardo, I always say he's an Italian-Cuban. Bernardo Toscano. Again, another indication that there are a lot of different nationalities that peopled Cuba in the past. But Bernardo was just so gracious, so kind, so informative, and taking care of things for us. He informed me that he'd been to visit 20 states in the United States. So he's been to 20 states, yet a U.S. citizen cannot go to Cuba to see Cuba. I'll have more to say about that later. But the trip we took, it was fascinating. And all along the way, in Santiago, all up the way, we saw tour buses with people. Well, they looked like North Americanos, But in fact, they were from England and Germany and Sweden and Canada, mostly Canada, a lot of Canadians. But there were people traveling, visiting different things. Canada right now, they have a direct flight from Toronto to Santa Clara, direct flight. And they can get on a bus and go out here to these wonderful beaches out here, which we didn't visit, but a lot of Canadians, a lot of Europeans go there, but not Americans. Not Americans. Again, I'm going to have more to say about that. But again, I want to thank so many people of Cuba, so many people I saw for the warm welcome, the hospitality they extended to me and my wife, my traveling companions, and my staff as we traveled throughout their country. And I just might add that prior to my election, long before my election to the Congress, I was a Navy pilot stationed at Guantanamo Bay for 18 months. So this was interesting to see the rest of Cuba other than just Guantanamo Bay, which is right down here. This is the Guantanamo Bay area. So it's right near Santiago de Cuba. In fact, landing at the airport in Santiago was quite interesting. One of the traveling companion I was with was a Navy pilot with me when I was stationed at Guantanamo. And he is Cuban American. And we remembered how we were always kind of warned when we were out flying not to get mistaken between Santiago and Guantanamo because the runways look exactly the same. They're both east-west runways. They're right there on the ocean. There's a bay on both of them. And if you weren't careful, you might land at one rather than the other. So all that time that we were flying out of there, we never, of course, never went to Santiago. Of course, we couldn't. But we used to see it as we patrolled the skies around Cuba. And so now landing at Santiago was kind of an interesting, kind of a flashback in time to when I was a young Navy pilot. I wanted to get a first-hand look at life of ordinary people outside of Havana. And particularly, I have long advocated in this country for a strong public health infrastructure. And I wanted to examine the strengths and weaknesses of Cuba's public health system. So as I said, that's what I did most of the time when I was there. When we first arrived in Santiago, we went to visit the cancer hospital, which provides treatment for people from across the entire country. I found the doctors there and the leaders of that hospital to be very dedicated public servants. The institution has struggled to overcome the devastation of Hurricane Sandy, which really hit Santiago very, very hard. Again, it would be mutually beneficial for both Cuba and the U.S. if we had better relations, if we had better trade relations with Cuba, where they might need some medical equipment that we have, but where we could also learn from them on some of the processes and procedures they use in treating cancer patients. I was struck by one thing. This was Friday afternoon. So we were going through this hospital. And yes, they've got all the necessary equipment. They have the radiation machines and all the equipment that you need to do a radiation and infusion for chemotherapy. They've got all that. As I said, the hospital suffered some damage from Sandy, and that hasn't been all fixed up yet. What was interesting is I was going through the hospital, I noticed a lot of empty beds. And so we were leaving, as we were leaving the hospital, I said to the director, I said, well, where are all the people? It looks like you got a lot of empty beds. And she said, oh, it's Friday afternoon. We send them home for the weekend. I said, really? And she said a very interesting thing to me. She said, yes. She said, you know, you come to the hospital to get cured, but you go home to get well. I thought about that. Because just not too long ago, I had an instance in Des Moines, Iowa, where I had visited a friend of mine who was seriously ill with cancer. He has since passed away. But he wanted to leave, literally wanted to leave the hospital for a Sunday meeting of the Methodist Church. He was a Methodist minister. And the hospital wouldn't let him leave. They said, if you leave, then you've got to be all readmitted again through Medicare, and Medicare will cut off the payments and all that, and there's all this. They wouldn't even let him leave for a few hours to go halfway across the city to partake in an award that he was supposed to receive. Then I thought about that when I saw this hospital. She said, no, we send people home for the weekend, then they come back on Monday. Just interesting things like that you pick up. So I think there'd be just a lot that the two of us could learn together. And Camagüey, well, we stopped in Holguin, also a small kind of a rural community, again with a very kind of comprehensive clinic system in Holguin. And as we drove on up the road to Camagüey, then in Camagüey, we had an interesting visit. We visited the home of Dr. Carlos Finley. Now, some people might say, who's Dr. Carlos Finley? Dr. Carlos Finley was the person who discovered the origin of yellow fever that is transmitted by a certain mosquito. A lot of people didn't believe him. They just did not believe him. But he persevered. And later on, it was a person sort of famous around here, at least we know the name, Dr. Walter Reed. Dr. Walter Reed, who, when they were building the Panama Canal, discovered that Dr. Finley was right. It was a transmission by mosquitoes. And so we were able to visit his home, and there is, again, a whole cadre of people there doing research on other transmissions of illnesses. For example, the transmission of different diseases by mosquitoes there. But again, a heavy focus on medical research. When we went to Santa Clara, we visited another clinic there. They call them polyclinics. Polyclinics. In other words, they do a lot of different things. It's sort of like what we might think of in this country as a community health center. It's a community health center. Unlike our community health centers, people don't have to just go there to seek help. The community health centers, the polyclinics, go out there. And they go out in very rural areas to make sure that kids have their vaccinations, to make sure that people have checkups. And one of the reasons they have such a low infant mortality rate, which some have said is lower than ours and is in fact one of the lowest in the world, and they have one of the lowest rates of mortality of children 0 to 5, is because when a woman gets pregnant in Cuba, she gets visited immediately, as soon as they know about it. She gets visited by a nurse, she gets visited by health officials who put her on a better diet, make sure she doesn't smoke, provide supportive services for her during her pregnancy, make sure that there's someone there for the birth, and that child everything is just covered from the earliest time of pregnancy through early childhood. And it's a hands-on approach. It's a hands-on, and it's going out, serving people rather than making people come into them. And this really, I think, is one of the key features of what Cuba has done, is they have made the practice of medicine a public service. A public service in all aspects, whether you're a doctor or a surgeon or a nurse or various other health practitioners. It is a public service. And Cuba has put a great deal of emphasis on prevention of illness. In fact, I must say that I was surprised in Cuba that they've gone on an anti-smoking campaign. So, Mr. President, I was out one night in Santiago, and we were out to dinner. We came back. It was about 10 o'clock at night, and I noticed that a street was blocked off. And there was a lot of people out there, and I asked Mr. Toscano what that was, and he asked somebody else. He said, well, in Santiago, every Friday and Saturday night, they block off long streets, and they have festivals. They have, like, street parties. So I said, well, I want to go there. So we parked our car, and we walked out we didn't have any guards or anybody around us. We just walked down the street, about a mile long. I mean, this is a long street, about a mile. Late at night, and you go down the street, and along the sides of the street, there are people cooking food, little kiosks. We even saw one whole hog on a spit being turned, people eating, families with kids out there, a lot of young people out there looking for other young people on Saturday night. Music, but every other block had some music, and it was just kind of a wonderful atmosphere. I noticed two things that I was kind of looking for during my walk down and back. How many people were smoking? I counted 4 people smoking. Thousands of people up and down these streets. And I counted 4 people smoking. Oh, there may have been more, but that's all I could find. And during this entire walk, with all these people out in the street, 10:30 at night, Saturday night, I saw one policeman. One policeman. And he didn't have any arms and any gun. He just had a stick. He was kind of walking around with a stick. And so there was this kind of a wonderful thing, but the idea being that no one was smoking, which kind of fascinated me. But Santiago, I always say, if you go back, if anyone ever goes back to Cuba, try to go to Santiago. It is so different than Havana. It's music. It's people are lively. It's what a wonderful atmosphere in that part of Cuba. But I digress. I wanted to say about the community-based health system and keeping people healthy. And what they have said is that it's not just the doctor's office. They say it's not just the doctor's office. That's just one component of keeping people healthy. It's the entire community, the schools, community-based approach that keeps people healthy. And that, I think, is something that we could learn from and do here in this country. During my visit with healthcare professionals, they explained that in the early 1980s, Cuba moved to expand a comprehensive family practice model throughout the country, with doctors and nurses, other health professionals working in teams, integrated into the neighborhoods where they live and they work. And this has become the pillar of primary health care in Cuba, and obviously has contributed to significant improvements in health outcomes. I think their longevity, lifespan is now even longer than ours in the United States. So, these changes and others have helped Cuba improve its health care system. There are several indicators of this. For instance, by the end of 2013, Cuba reported that its infant mortality rate had declined to 4.2 per 1,000 live births, the lowest in its history, one of the lowest in the world. By comparison, the U.S. had an infant mortality rate of 5.9 per 1,000 live births. Also, over the past couple of decades, Cuba has increased the number of medical personnel that it sends abroad to serve on medical missions, filling critical needs in underserved countries. There are currently nearly 44,000 Cuban medical personnel working in many countries around the world. Last year, I took a trip to Namibia and South Africa, and I saw Cuban doctors working there, actually sometimes alongside our own doctors from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Interesting, we can work with them there, but we can't work with them here, I guess. So they do. They have sent them all over the world. Also in Havana, I visited a very interesting place I'd never heard about. It's called the Latin American Medical School. So the Latin America Medical School. And it's right outside of Havana. It's about 20 miles to the west of Havana. And it was an old Navy base, a naval academy. And evidently, President Castro decided they didn't really need a naval academy, so they closed down and made it a medical school. And students come from not only all over Latin America, but around the world come there to go to medical school. And believe it or not, there are students from America going to school in Havana, going to medical school. Mr. President, this blew my mind. I never heard of such a thing. Well, here's what I found out. I found out that in the year 2000, the Congressional Black Caucus had a trip to Havana During that trip, they met with President Castro, and one of the congressmen, Congressman Benny Thompson from Mississippi, had said something about how difficult it was for them to get people in certain areas of Mississippi. He said there was large areas in his home district didn't have a single physician, and also they talked about how expensive it was to go to medical school. So President Castro invited American students to come there, and they worked it out. And I think the first class started, if I'm not mistaken, in 2002. I believe it was the first class. And now, believe it or not, there are 108 U.S. students going to this school. Well, I didn't see them all because a lot of them, during their schooling, they go out and work in hospitals and clinics and different things like that. So I just met with 6 of them. And it was just very interesting. There was, let's see, from left is Michael, who was from California, Nikolai from the Queens in New York, Kimberly also from Northern California, Ariel is from Michigan, Olive is from Wisconsin, and Sarah is from New Mexico. Now, all of them are first-year students except for Sarah, who's a third-year student and is sort of their, well, what do you call it, watches over them. What do you call it? They're sort of their tutor or their leader. So I met with them, and it was very interesting. The only requirement, there are requirements before you can go there. You have to be from extremely low-income family, cannot afford to go to medical school. You have to be a college graduate, so you have to have graduated in one of the sciences like biology or one of the physical sciences, something like that. So you have to have graduated from college. And third, you have to agree that when you graduate, you are going to come back to America and work in an underserved area. And here's the deal. Every one of these students are going to medical school, and you know what it costs them? 0. Not 1 cent. The 108 students are there, pay nothing. We have over 90 graduates of this school back here in America right now. And that's another thing. Whenever we traveled all over Cuba, I went to the clinics and I talked to health people. I'd always ask them, what did it cost you to go to school? Do you have student debt? No. Medical school is free. There is no cost to going to medical school. None whatsoever. So here are these students who would never be able to go to medical school and absorb that cost. But here, they're getting a free medical education. And so again, another one of the things that we could be working with Cuba on if we had a little bit better policy with Cuba. The 6 students I met with were happy, grateful to have the opportunity. They were just out of their first 6 months. These are all freshmen. They were just out of 6 months. And for the first 6 months, all they do is learn Spanish immersion. And they've just finished that, so they were very happy about that, that now we're going to start actually studying medicine. So, again, so many different things, but mostly I focused mostly on health care and what they were doing on health care. I also met with Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez, had a long lunch with him. Again, their former ambassador to the United Nations. He's now their foreign minister. And we had a long discussion about our relationships with Cuba. And I hope I'm not in any way discussing any private conversations, but basically I think I can say that he himself said it's time that we have a new relationship with the United States. It's time for a new course. We can't be bound by old history. We need to make new history. And so I think that's what I would just like to echo here is that we do have a constructive new policy between Cuba and America. The last thing I did was I paid a visit to Mr. Alan Gross, right here. Mr. Alan Gross. This is my staff member, Rosemary Gutierrez, who went with us on our trip and made sure that what I was hearing was correct in terms of the Spanish, since I don't speak Spanish fluently. Well, Mr. Gross, as you know, has been in prison now for over 4 years. I am hopeful that he'll be released soon on humanitarian grounds. I'm going to be working with our government to engage with the Cuban government in serious and sustained talks to resolve his situation and other related issues. I might just add what we're holding here is a little chain. What he does in his spare time, he puts things together out of bottle caps, plastic bottle caps. He's now serving a 15-year prison sentence. I spent well over an hour with him. I think he's holding up pretty well under the circumstances. Obviously, he's not very happy. Who would be happy being locked up like that? He's confined to his room for 23 hours a day, but he's allowed outside. He told me he walks 10,000 steps a day, and he does 50 pull-ups for an hour each day. And so he makes these bracelets out of the rings out of water bottles. He reads, he watches television. He says he has television. He has things to read. And I know other senators here have visited with him in Havana. But it's time to bring Mr. Gross home. It's time to end it. It's time that we do some dealings with the Cuban government on his issue and on some other related issues that I don't need to go into right now, but the administration knows of which I speak. There's no reason why we can't return Mr. Gross to this country this year, and I'm hopeful that that will be done. It's time to recognize that Cuba is our neighbor, that it's not only our neighbor, but is a sovereign nation. And we have to work to improve this relationship, 90 miles from our shores. It's obvious to visitors that the Cuban people and the American people have a great deal in common. I want to say one other thing, Mr. President. In all my travel through Cuba, we stopped at various places, stopped to have refreshments at a couple of bars here and there, stopped in small communities. Every small town we went through or by has a baseball diamond, or maybe 2 baseball diamonds. It's amazing how many people play baseball in Cuba. I mean, they have town teams, and towns will have 2 teams, one section of town against the other section of town. Kids all play baseball. Wouldn't that be great if we had some kind of relationship where some of our small baseball teams in the United States could go to Cuba and play? We know they've got some pretty good players because some of them have come up here and played in our major leagues. But in every place I stopped, and the people we talked to, I never heard one Cuban, not one, ever say a bad thing about the United States of America or about the American people. I just never heard one. I expected that some would say, you know, you're doing bad things to Cuba with your embargo, and we don't like Americans for this. I expected to hear that. I never heard it once. You know what the most often thing I heard from ordinary Cubans? Where are you from? Well, I said, well, I'm from Iowa, and I work in Washington, D.C. And the usual response I got was, oh, do you know my cousin so-and-so who lives in St. Louis? Or my cousin so-and-so who lives here or there? Seems like every Cuban has a cousin in America someplace. Even one woman said her son lives in Michigan. But there's this sense that we just have a lot in common. And I just never felt any animosity whatsoever. It's clear that we have a lot in common. We're both hardworking people. Want access to basic health care, good education for their kids. And that's another thing. I didn't spend a lot of time looking at education, but it was clear to me that the literacy rate in Cuba is very high. Now, some have said it's the highest of all Latin American countries. I can't attest to that. I don't know. But it's clear that education is a very important part of the Cuban structure. Over the years, I met with many Iowans, business people, diplomats who want to improve our relationship with Cuba, facilitate more trade, more travel with our neighbors. Even with the limited opening of Cuba's markets, we have seen tremendous benefits from agricultural exports to Cuba, from my state of Iowa and other parts of the United States. It's only our official policy that stands in the way of much greater exports of U.S. commodities and food products, plus related agricultural machinery, technology, and so forth. Another thing I noticed, we went through a lot of farms. We saw a lot of agriculture. mostly sugar cane, but other things too. A lot of cattle. This whole section of Cuba here, in this area here, just almost all cattle, livestock, goats and cattle, and other agriculture. I want to say this. This is the first and only country I have ever visited and where I went out to see agricultural entities. It's the only country where I've never seen a John Deere tractor or a John Deere implement of any kind. I can go to China. I went to almost the Tibetan border in China, and there's John Deere equipment. John Deere equipment in Africa, John Deere equipment in Pakistan, India. Well, if we had better trade, I might see some more John Deere implements down in Cuba, which would be great for their productivity. We would also benefit from a two-way trade. There's many things grown in Cuba that we have appetites for: fruits, vegetables, fresh fruits that consumers in our country want. Now, again, I think Americans really do want to change our policy. I have here the Atlantic Council. On February the 11th, they released the results of its latest poll, which found that 56% of the American people support the normalization of relations with Cuba, including 63% of Floridians don't want to normalize relations with Cuba. I think we've had a policy of isolation for far too long, and as this latest poll indicates, the American people think so too. After being in place for over 50 years, this embargo has not been effective in any way. Our policy has benefited neither the Cuban people nor the American people. Both the U.S. and Cuba have recently taken steps to allow for greater travel. It's a significant step forward. The Cuban government has eliminated its long-standing policy of requiring an exit permit and a letter of invitation for Cubans to travel abroad. This change in policy has allowed for prominent dissidents and human rights activists to travel abroad from Cuba. Additionally, restrictions on remittances have been lifted. I think remittances now from Cuban Americans to their families, I think now is their second largest export earner, second to sugar. The United States and Cuba have resumed low-level talks on migration, search and rescue operations, other issues. I might mention one other. When I was in Guantanamo a week or so ago, led by Senator Tester, it was Captain Nettleton, who was the base commander, took me around the base because I'd been stationed there, as I said, about 53 years ago. So I kind of wanted to see some of the old places. And as he was driving me around, he took me up to the gate. Coming back, I said, "Do you ever have contact with Cubans?" He said, "Oh, yes, we do." In fact, 2 years ago, the last of the Cubans retired working at Guantanamo. They lived in Cuba but worked on Guantanamo, and just until 2 years ago. But he told me that recently he went to visit the hospital in Guantanamo City. Now, that's not on the map, but it's right down here. It's right outside of Guantanamo Bay, our naval base. He went to visit the hospital there because they have a burn unit. They do not have a burn unit on Guantanamo in our facility. And so they've made a handshake deal and an agreement that if we have burn victims on Guantanamo, we can take them to the hospital in Guantanamo City. Amazing. So little things like that are happening. Things like that are happening that are kind of opening the door. So we should build on these small but positive changes in our relationship. The U.S. should abandon our policy of seeking Cuba's isolation. We should lift all restrictions on travel to Cuba. What is our justification for denying Americans the right to travel to Cuba? We should allow for all U.S. citizens wishing to go to Cuba to do so. This would expose more Cubans to our young people, our ideas, interactions. You go there, you see a lot of Canadians and a lot of Europeans. And now Cuban Americans can go to Cuba freely. If you're Cuban American, you can get on one of, I think there are about 4 or 5, maybe 4 to 7 daily flights from Fort Lauderdale, Miami, and Key West to Cuba. If you're a U.S. citizen, you can't get on one of those unless you have a permit from the U.S. government. But if you're Cuban American, you can get on a plane and go to Cuba. Come back. And more are doing so. Now, as of last year, Americans, I believe now, are the second largest group to visit Cuba, but they're all Cuban Americans. So we have this crazy policy. If you're Cuban American, you can go to Cuba, but if you're not, you can't. Someone please explain that one to me. Well, Mr. President, it's time for us to chart a new course. Our relationship is frozen in a Cold War mentality that's not achieved its goals. It's made it difficult to move forward on issues that encourage more trade and travel between our two countries. Our policy also fails to promote more openness and respect for internationally recognized human rights. Multiple layers of sanctions remain in place, making it difficult for U.S. businesses to trade with Cuba. Both the Cuban people and U.S. national interests would benefit from a modernized and sensible policy. Now is not the time to be bound and held back by history. It is time to make new history. It is time to begin a new chapter in the relations of our two countries. I hope the Obama administration, the Cuban government, will seize this opportunity to do just that, to modernize, move ahead, and recognizing always and foremost that Cuba is a sovereign nation. They will not be dominated by America or any other country, and that we have to deal with them just as we do any other sovereign nation. I might just conclude, Mr. President, by saying I had the opportunity on a trip led by Senator Tester, and we had 2 other senators on the trip, to visit Guantanamo Bay, the detention center. We toured camps 5 and 6, which house the majority of the detainees held at Guantanamo. We also had a tour of the facilities that hold high-value detainees, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Based on my own observations from my tour of Guantanamo, reports I've read about previous conditions, it does appear that the detainees are being treated more humanely now than previously, and that conditions at Guantanamo are in line with how the detainees would be treated if they were held in a U.S. prison. However, this trip reinforced my long-held conviction that the detention facility at Guantanamo should be closed as soon as possible. Its very existence, remote, offshore, not subject to the laws of the United States, make it impossible to justify its existence. That's why I introduced a bill to close the facility as far back as 2007. It's why I continue to believe that federal courts and federal prisons are fully capable of dealing with these detainees. The indefinite detention of hundreds of individuals, some for over 13 years at this point, has harmed our image abroad, complicated relations with friendly countries, and I think really violates the basic principles of our Constitution. It's not acceptable, and the existence of this facility cannot be justified when there is an alternative, and there is. And I'm not alone in advocating for this prison's closure. Military and foreign policy officials across the political spectrum have made it clear that we must close the detention center at Guantanamo. Leaders including Colin Powell, Henry Kissinger, James Baker, Madeleine Albright, Warren Christopher, Robert Gates, David Petraeus, CIA Director John Brennan have all said closing the detention center at Guantanamo is critical to our national security. Again, I have no illusions regarding these detainees. Some are extremely dangerous terrorists with the determination and ability, if given the opportunity, to inflict great harm on the United States and its citizens. But indeed, prisons in the United States are already holding many of the world's most dangerous terrorists, criminals who have been found guilty in a court of law. These include Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, Zacharias Messiah, the 9/11 co-conspirator, Richard Reed, the shoe bomber. If we can successfully try these terrorists in courts and hold them in our prisons, we can do the same with the Guantanamo detainees. So in closing, Mr. President, I think it's long past due that we re-examine our policy toward Cuba. I call upon the Obama administration to not waste any more time. Get to it. Let's change our policy. Let's start making new history, not be detained by the old history. And secondly, it's time that we close the prison in Guantanamo. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.